Blackbeard became one of Luffy's greatest villains by wielding 2 devil fruits. But what if Ace had that same power? At Marineford, Ace and Whitebeard both fell. But imagine if Ace inherited Whitebeard's devil fruit instead of Blackbeard. How would the story of One Piece change? The war at Marineford had been chaotic from the start. The world's strongest pirates and the Marines were clashing, so it was no wonder that the battlefield was absolute hell. And through all of it, Ace had only one thought pressing in his chest. His family was here, bleeding and dying because of him. Every Whitebeard pirate thought like the world would end if they failed, because to them, it would if Ace died here. That thought burned heavier than any chain around his wrists. The Marines were relentless, and Ace felt powerless, a spectator in the middle of a storm, watching his family tear themselves apart to save him. And then came Luffy. His little brother stumbled into the war, reckless and stubborn as ever, his body already battered from breaking into the greatest prison in the world. Ace wanted to shout at him, to beg him to leave, but deep inside he felt a warmth he couldn't describe. Luffy would never abandon him. That was just who he was. Everywhere Luffy went, allies followed. Even Kov's strange power kept him moving when no man should still be standing. Crocodile, of all people, fought at his side with sandstorms tearing through navy lines. Jinbei shielded him like a wall of the ocean itself. Ace had never felt so proud and so ashamed at the same time. Proud that Luffy was strong enough to stand in this war, ashamed that it was all for him. The war reached its breaking point when Luffy got far enough to break Ace's chains. Mr. Three's candle wax shaped into a key was enough, and soon the shackles fell from Ace's hands, and for the first time since his capture, he was finally free. But then came Sakazuki. The Admiral's voice was sharp, filled with venom, as he spat words that cut deeper than any blade. He mocked Whitebeard, called him a failure, said his era was over, and his family was nothing but trash. The insult burned hotter than fire itself, and Ace just couldn't let Sakazuki's words slide. So he did something incredibly dumb and faced the Admiral. And he soon found out just how bad of a decision he had made. He could have escaped with Luffy, could have made this war worth it. But now, Sakazuki was about to put a hole through Luffy's chest, and Ace's body moved on its own. But Whitebeard moved first. The old man appeared between them like a wall of flesh and will, and Sakazuki's molten fist punched through his waist, burning bone and tearing muscle. But Whitebeard did not flinch. His hand clamped down on Sakazuki with fury unlike any Ace had ever seen. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent as Whitebeard's quake-infused punch shook the air around them. With a quake that split the earth, Whitebeard punched Sakazuki in the face and threw him like a ragdoll in the air before hitting him again and burying him into the ground. But it was clear that Whitebeard's injuries were near fatal, and Ace was too weak to even stand. Then came Blackbeard. The traitor stepped into Marineford with his band of criminals, and Whitebeard's eyes hardened as he faced him. Whitebeard's thoughts were silent, but Ace could see the weight in his eyes. This was the end of their story. The two clashed, but Whitebeard's powers were nullified by Blackbeard. Despite this, Whitebeard pushed through and nearly overpowered him, but it wasn't enough. And as Ace watched, Blackbeard dealt the finishing blow before shrouding Whitebeard's body with a cloth, and something unnatural began. Darkness swirled, pulling at the old man's standing corpse. Something inside Ace snapped. His legs moved before his mind caught up as rage drowned out the pain and the exhaustion. He leapt forward. The darkness writhed around Blackbeard, but Ace grabbed what was in Blackbeard's hand and bit into it. He couldn't make out what it was, but he knew that Whitebeard's power was in this, the power of his devil fruit. And he also knew that he would die while consuming it. There was no way his body could handle the power of 2 devil fruits. Pain exploded through his chest, a storm of heat and crushing force tearing him apart from the inside. Yet the death he expected never came. Instead, his flames suddenly exploded outward, and with it, something else. His whole body vibrated like he was holding back a storm that had no end. The battlefield seemed to grow quiet for an instant as Ace felt eyes on him and then felt Blackbeard close the distance. He lunged at Ace out of anger, with darkness writhing around his body, reaching out like claws. Ace reacted without thinking. His hand came up in a fist. An instinct told him to launch fire, but instead of fire, the air cracked. A massive ripple burst forward from where he'd punched, and the space began to shake like something had struck it. The force smashed into Blackbeard, hurling him across the battlefield. He crashed into the rubble of Marineford's plaza, leaving a crater so deep that smoke poured from it like a chimney. For the first time, the traitor groaned in pain instead of laughter. Ace stared at his own hand. His flames danced over his knuckles, but beneath them, the tremors continued like the world was shuddering against his will. The silence of the battlefield broke as voices began to shout, saying things like how this was Whitebeard's power, and how Ace could possibly have 2 devil fruits. The Blackbeard pirates didn't waste time, and they charged at Ace. Ace planted his feet, and again out of instinct, he cracked the ground below his feet and made the entire island shake. The shockwave created a mess and began splitting the island, throwing the Blackbeard pirates off their feet and the Marines. And the Whitebeard pirates around him as Marco told Ace to stop while flying in front of him defensively, facing the enemy. For the first time, Ace felt a flicker of something he had never felt before. Fear of his own strength. His fire was something he understood, something he had grown into, but this power was completely new to him. Blackbeard clawed his way out of the crater, blood trickling down his face. He shouted Ace's name with rage as darkness coiled tighter around him, but his eyes betrayed his fear. And then suddenly a massive wave of Conqueror's hockey washed over the battlefield, and it made everyone take their eyes off of of Ace. Shanks had appeared. Shanks' eyes swept across the battlefield, and as they locked with Blackbeard, the tyrant stepped back and ordered a retreat. He bit down on his failure and quickly vanished into the shadows. Even the Marines stiffened. Sengoku narrowed his eyes, and he saw what Shanks' arrival meant. This war had gone too far, and now they would have to risk fighting another emperor if they continued it. Ace wasn't dead, and that would mean shame for the Marines, but Whitebeard, an emperor, had fallen. Sengoku raised his hand, his voice echoing across the battlefield. He declared the war finished. The Marines, though reluctant, obeyed. The guns lowered. The admiral stepped back, and the tide of soldiers that had flooded Marineford finally stilled. Ace stood frozen, still trembling with the power in his veins. He looked at Shanks, then at the Whitebeard pirates gathering around him and Luffy. His brother was there, all panting and bruised, and he was barely standing, but he had the biggest grin on his face. Marco appeared weakly, injured, and clearly saddened as the rest of the crew gathered when Marco ordered the retreat. They'd survived, but they lost their father. Ace looked back once at the ruined plaza where Whitebeard's body was still standing lifeless. Ace clenched his fists as Marco and Jozu went to retrieve it, and Ace couldn't stop the tears from flowing. He didn't know when Luffy took him back to the Moby deck, but he soon came back to his senses after bawling his eyes out in his brother's arms. The battlefield was behind them, but the silence of the retreat was heavier than the sounds of war. Every ship that carried the survivors of the Whitebeard pirates felt like a coffin drifting across the waves. No one spoke more than they had to, and the sound of the sea filled the air. Ace went and sat on the deck's edge, finally coming to terms with what had happened. His father had passed away, and the world lost more than it could have imagined. It was the end of an era with Whitebeard, and every pirate in the crew felt that loss. And now, Ace carried his will somehow. Marco approached quietly. His steps were slower than usual because his body was still bruised up from the war. He sat beside Ace without saying anything at first, letting the silence rest between them before he finally told Ace what Whitebeard had said before his death. That the old man had wished for a new era. That he had wanted his children to carry on without him. That most of all, he had wanted one of them to claim the title of Pirate King, to stand above the seas and bring an end to the age of false rulers. Marco turned to Ace. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a will, and Whitebeard had chosen him. Even his devil fruit had chosen him. Ace's throat tightened. He looked down at his hands as flames flickered faintly across his palms while the air around them quivered in ripples. He felt torn in two. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted to live under the shadow of a great name. His blood as the son of Roger had haunted him, and now the legacy of Whitebeard pressed down even heavier. But then he remembered the old man's smile, the way he had called them his sons without hesitation. Whitebeard's dream wasn't about power. It was about family. Ace clenched his fists. If this was the dream Whitebeard had left behind, then he couldn't run from it. He owed him that much. Luffy came closer and Ace punched him in the head before telling him to lighten up, and then he grinned widely, saying that Luffy was going to have some competition as the Pirate King now. Luffy grinned back before saying that Ace would have to fight him for the title. Jinbei stepped forward then and told Luffy that he'd have to grow much stronger. Boa Hancock stepped towards them too and told Luffy that he could come to the island to rest before going on his journey. Luffy knew he had to get stronger, especially now that Ace was in the running too. When the ship split, Ace and Luffy exchanged one last look, vowing to meet again, stronger than ever. Back on the Whitebeard ship, the commanders gathered. They'd faced some hefty losses, and all of them were raging over Blackbeard, the man who betrayed them and started this entire mess. But they were more curious about how Ace could possibly have acquired the devil fruit. Everything they knew told them that it was supposed to be a death sentence. Marco came closer to examine Ace, who himself realized that there was something definitely weird about all of this. Marco pressed his ear to Ace's chest and checked the pulse, only to find out that Ace didn't have just one heartbeat. He had two! The room fell silent, and suddenly they realized that either Ace was born with this special body, or somehow the devil fruit had created a new heart. They couldn't be sure, but they knew that it was a miracle, and it was a powerful miracle now that Ace possessed a devil fruit that previously belonged to the strongest man in the world. Ace rose slowly, since his body still hurt, but he'd made the decision. He told the entire crew that if he was to carry these powers, if he was to carry Whitebeard's will, he couldn't waste a moment, and that he had to train harder than ever before. Revenge would come later. He would master both the Mera Mera no Mi and the Gura Gura no Mi, no matter how hard it was. The commanders nodded one by one. They would follow him, not because of his blood, not because of his new power, but because he was Ace, their brother, their comrade, and now their captain. While Ace buried himself in training, the world outside moved like a storm that never rested. The fall of Marineford had left holes in the balance of power, and Blackbeard wasted no time tearing them wider. The Whitebeard territories, once untouchable under the shadow of their captain, now stood exposed. Ace's order had been clear. Avoid open war. The crew needed time to recover, and he needed time to master the burden of his two fruits. But Blackbeard knew this too. He tested their defenses with raids and ambushes, picking at the edges, forcing the Whitebeard pirates to bleed little by little. The first clash came at Sphinx Island. It was more than a territory. It was Whitebeard's homeland. Blackbeard sent Jesus Burgess and Van Augur with a small fleet, confident they could seize it quickly. Marco and Jozu led the defense. His flames of regeneration carried him through every bullet Augur fired, while Burgess charged with fists heavy as cannons. But Marco had fought giants before, and his speed made Burgess look clumsy. And Jozu himself had an impenetrable defense that Augur simply couldn't snipe through. The battle raged across the rocky cliffs, the people of Sphinx watching in fear. Marco's calm precision turned the tide. He struck Burgess with flaming talons, and the two barely escaped with their lives. The Whitebeard crew held their ground, but the message was clear. Blackbeard would not stop. Months later, another strike came. This time, Shiryu of the Rain led it, his invisible blade cutting through ships in the New World. Vista, the swordsman of Whitebeard's crew, met him on the waves. The clash was brutal. Shiryu's invisibility made him a ghost on the battlefield, striking without warning, while Vista's mastery of the sword allowed him to parry even strikes he could not see. Their duel lasted hours, blades ringing across the ocean spray, neither one decisively. Vista protected the fleet, but the territory near it was gone. Several ships sank, and some territories fell. The sea seemed to grow darker with every fight. Meanwhile, Ace trained. He began in isolation, far from the crew, on an island that was already uninhabited after years of storms. The air smelled of sulfur, and the ground was cracked and uneven, but it was perfect for him since if he lost control, no one else would pay the price. The Mera Mera no Mi was familiar, his flames an extension of his will, but the Gura Gura no Mi was a monster in his chest. At first, even the smallest effort nearly killed him. A punch that should have struck only air would instead collapse an entire cliffside. A stomp in frustration would split the earth open and almost send him plummeting down into the depths. It was a good thing he had the Mera Mera no Mi to fly, but he quickly learned that control mattered more than raw power. Fire could be small or large, and quakes could be the same. He practiced striking water with a fingertip until the ripples stopped spreading too far. He practiced forming quakes in the air that cracked but didn't shatter. For months, he made a mess of the island. There were craters, broken ridges, and flattened land everywhere. But little by little, he grew. His body toughened against the strain, and his mind sharpened. He began to use fire and quake together, combining the speed of flame with the weight of tremors. He would launch a burning fist, then ripple the air behind it to accelerate the blow. He would cloak himself in fire, then send tiny quakes through the ground to knock enemies off balance before striking. He knew that if he lost control in real battle, he could kill his own family just as easily as his enemies. It was a balance he had to master, or he would become more dangerous than Blackbeard himself. Then he also refined his haki. He knew Blackbeard could easily strip away the power of both the devil fruits, so he had to increase his core strength. Sure, his powers were amazingly strong, but Blackbeard was his exact opposite, and he needed to work on methods to deal with him. And 2 years passed with that. The Whitebeard pirates fought dozens of skirmishes during that time. They lost some territories, but they held on to the heart of Whitebeard's domain. Sphinx stood strong. The main fleet survived, and through every loss and every retreat, they knew that Ace was getting stronger. The day came when he returned from training, his body leaner, his eyes sharper. He stood before the crew on the deck of their flagship. For the first time since Marineford, his flames did not flicker out of control, and the air around him did not tremble without reason. He was steady, calm, a storm waiting to be unleashed. He raised his hand and with a single motion cracked the sky. The tremor spread wide but did not break anything it touched. He snapped his fingers and a controlled flame burned, small enough to light a lantern. Then, with a deep breath, he combined them, and a wave of fire rippled forward, shaped and carried by a quake, scorching the sea without scattering the ships. The crew cheered. For the first time in years, they felt the same confidence they had once known under Whitebeard. Their captain was no longer a man caught between powers. He was the ace of both flame and quake. Marco smacked him on the back and smiled wide as the rest of the guys gathered around and threw Ace up in the air to celebrate. This moment finally felt like the beginning of something new after everything they'd faced in the last 2 years. And Ace knew it was time to get revenge against the man who'd ruined their crew, Blackbeard. But first, it was time for a little test. Marco and Jozu wanted to spar with their new captain, so the crew went back to the island where Ace had trained. Most of them stayed on their ship so Ace, Marco, and Jozu could go all out. And soon, the fight began. Ace lunged forward with his fists wrapped in fire and quake energy at once. Marco blurred into motion, wings of blue flame flaring wide as he launched himself at Ace with a twisting kick. Ace caught the strike on his forearm as Jozu closed the distance like a charging juggernaut. Ace pivoted, flames bursting from his heels to propel him aside, then released a shockwave punch that cracked the air. Jozu braced, the quake forcing him back across the dirt, but his body held firm. Marco swooped from above, talons of blue fire cutting arcs toward Ace's chest. Ace let his body burst into flame, dispersing the strike, then reformed behind Marco with a quake-infused uppercut. The air split, distorting like shattered glass, and Marco was flung skyward before stabilizing himself with a spread of wings. The fight went on for quite some time before Ace slammed both fists down. A fissure split open across the field, fire spewing from the cracks as a dome of heat and seismic force erupted. Jozu charged straight through it and drove his shoulder upward, smashing into Ace's ribs and sending him tumbling into the air. But Ace recovered in an instant. He grinned, and his flames began to burn a bright blue. Ace extended both arms, one cloaked in crackling fire, the other shuddering with quake power. With a sweep, he unleashed a double wave, a wall of roaring flames carried by seismic shock. Marco and Jozu braced side by side, Marco's phoenix flames shielding against the fire, and Jozu's diamond form absorbing the quake. The ground shattered beneath him, the field carved into smoking craters. In the settling dust, Ace appeared again, charging through with fire-propelled speed. His fists collided with Marco and Jozu in rapid succession, fire exploding against blue flame, quake rippling against diamond. The three of them clashed in a storm of raw force, every strike sending thunder across the island. Finally, Ace vaulted high, flames trailing from his legs like afterburners. He twisted midair, drawing both hands together as if cradling the sun itself. The sphere of fire roared alive, veins of quake energy spiraling within and pulsing with destructive potential. Marco shot upward, wings beating, talons outstretched to intercept. Jozu launched from below, fist cocked like a diamond cannonball. 2 years of relentless training had forged Ace into something far beyond what he once was. The Mera no Mi burned hotter than ever, his flames refined to the point of becoming nearly living extensions of his will, and he had mastered the Gura no Mi. Even Ace's haki had evolved, but it was his Conqueror's haki that had matured most dangerously. Ace could now fuse it with his attacks, coating flames and quakes in kingly willpower, turning each strike into a declaration of dominance. Ace released the orb, and both Marco and Jozu stared up before the orb was thrown upward by Ace himself. The explosion that followed lit the sky, a blinding fusion of quake shock and incandescent flame that tore through the air in concentric waves. The three looked up, Marco and Jozu's jaws dropped. Ace had become extremely strong. They knew he was ready. The first whisper of Blackbeard's movements reached Ace when Marco returned from the Sky Patrol. He told the crew that Burgess was moving forward with another raid on their territory. Ace grinned and told them that he'd handle this one himself. It was finally time to make a comeback. Ace's eyes narrowed. This was it, the moment to step into the light. Ace set sail with only a small escort, but by the time his ship neared the island, they spent some time there before Burgess finally arrived. Around him was a group of criminals and mercenaries who seemed confident that they could take the entire island. But when they entered the town, Ace simply waited on top of a roof. The town had been evacuated, and he called out for Burgess to get his attention. Burgess stood in shock. They had thought that Ace had gone into hiding since he had been nowhere to be seen for the last 2 years, but now he had returned. He needed to send word to Blackbeard right away. But first, he grew excited at the thought of how Blackbeard would reward him if he captured Ace. He had grown overconfident. Burgess grinned as Ace stepped down from the roof, and he began to taunt him. Ace simply smiled and said, "You're the first message I'm sending to Blackbeard, so don't blink." Burgess was confused as Ace vanished in a blur, flames sparking at his heels, then reappeared beside him with a blazing Heiken. The fire punch struck Burgess square in the chest, sending him flying through a row of houses before he crashed into the dirt, coughing up blood. Enraged at the sheer amount of damage he had taken with a single punch, Burgess ripped a massive boulder from the ground and hurled it like a cannonball. Ace raised his palm, and a quake burst forth. The air itself fractured, splitting the boulder into dust before it reached him. Burgess froze mid-charge, eyes wide at the sight. Ace's flames flared up as he grinned and rushed toward Burgess once more. The battlefield became a stage for chaos, as Burgess kept throwing boulders and trying to hit Ace, while the latter was simply toying with him. Burgess fought desperately, but Ace's movements were precise and deliberate. His observation haki allowed him to predict each charge. His armament-coated fists burned through Burgess's defenses, each hit landing heavier than the last. At one point, Burgess managed to grab Ace by the arm, muscles straining as he tried to crush him. But in the next moment, a quake burst from Ace's body, combined with spiraling flames, creating a dragon-shaped eruption of fire and shockwaves that engulfed Burgess. The masked wrestler screamed as the attack blasted him across the island, slamming him into the cliffs hard enough to collapse them. When the dust cleared, Burgess lay broken and bloodied, barely conscious. His crewmates, trembling, dropped their weapons. Ace told them to run along and tell Blackbeard that he was coming for his head. Word of the battle spread like wildfire, and far across the seas, when the tale reached Blackbeard himself, he laughed, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Blackbeard knew this was going to be a major wrench in his plans, but he also considered it an opportunity to get the devil fruit he had his eyes on. The war was going to begin. Meanwhile, Luffy was making his own path through the world. 2 years of silence had given birth to 2 storms. On one side, Ace had honed his dual powers until fire and quake obeyed his will as though they were extensions of his spirit, while his brother had already invaded an emperor's home and escaped to another's. And now there was word that the remnants of the Whitebeard pirates were going to war with Emperor Blackbeard. The Marines knew what was going on, and the admirals and fleet commander weighed their choices. They decided that they would simply let the pirates deal with each other. The 2 opposing crews were gathering their forces. Blackbeard's laughter echoed through Hachinosu, and his crew had already grown extremely strong, swelling with criminals drawn from the deepest levels of Impel Down. They may have lost Burgess, but there were still enough people to replace him. In the land of Wano, another fire began to rise. Luffy, after 2 years under Rayleigh's brutal training, now carried a strength of will that blazed brighter than ever. His fists, coated in armament and sharpened by observation, rattled the steel of Kaido's defenses. The rebellion on Onigashima surged to life, samurai banners fluttering, minks roaring under the moon, and the Straw Hats charging headlong into history. While Ace gathered his brothers for war, Luffy waged his own against a tyrant who ruled through fear. 2 paths, forged in the same fire of destiny, advanced towards similar places. On the eve of departure, Ace stood before the remnants of Whitebeard's fleet. His presence radiated strength that no longer needed words. Fire curled around his arms, gentle yet unyielding, while faint tremors rippled beneath beneath his feet with each heartbeat. The commanders felt the weight of both fruits, now harmonized within him. Smaller ships lined the sides, crews prepared with weapons polished and sails unfurled. Marco addressed the gathering, his blue flames flickering in the dim twilight. The Whitebeard pirates had endured Blackbeard's advances, losing ground but never surrendering spirit. Now they would carry their father's will once more, not as remnants but as warriors of a legacy reborn. For the first time since Marineford, the fleet felt alive, unified, and unshaken. Ace's fire was their beacon. News of their movement spread like wildfire. Islands whispered of the gathering storm. Blackbeard himself laughed upon hearing it, welcoming the challenge. His fleet prepared for the coming war as Hachinosu bristled with cannons, defenses, and bloodthirsty men eager to spill more blood. The seas between them grew tense, merchants and wanderers fleeing routes that might intersect with the two powers. Neutral islands fortified themselves, praying to avoid the inevitable shockwaves. The balance of the world hung on the cusp of collapse. As dawn broke over the new world, the Whitebeard pirates raised their sails. The fleet cut through waves with renewed fury, with Ace at the head. It was time to take the fight to Blackbeard himself. Meanwhile, Luffy's rebellion raged across Wano. His strikes shook Kaido's fortress, his allies pressed onward, and the dawn of Wano drew near. As Hachinosu came into sight, the tension coiled like a serpent ready to strike. Blackbeard's banners flew up, and all of his commanders and criminals were waiting to get rid of the Whitebeard pirates once and for all. They thought it was going to be easy with Blackbeard's nullification abilities, and they were already thinking of what they would do with the new territory they were going to acquire after the Whitebeard pirates were defeated. The Whitebeard fleet slowed, forming up with the Moby deck at the center like the heart of the storm. Ace stood at its bow, his flames rising higher, his quake tremors vibrating through the planks beneath his feet. This was no longer the young man who once recklessly chased after Blackbeard. This was the successor of Whitebeard. The air grew heavy, as though the world itself held its breath. Blackbeard's forces roared from the island, ready to feast on the blood of their enemies. The Whitebeard pirates stood resolute, their ships aligned, their spirits hardened by years of loss and training. Then, the war began much like it had 2 years back. Ace stepped forward, cracked the air around him, and the sea began to shake. The grin on the criminals' faces faded as they were soon covered in shadow when two massive tsunamis rose over them. It was going to swallow the island. Even Blackbeard panicked as he was reminded of Marineford. How could the boy have gotten this strong? Then something dashed up from the island and froze the two massive tsunamis. Former Admiral Kuzan himself had appeared. Just like before, he prevented the attack from wiping out the island before the battle even began, and Ace was furious to see a Marine teaming up with the Blackbeard pirates. But it didn't matter. He didn't have to hold back this time. As Ace dove in like a comet, the others followed suit. The clash was inevitable. 2 years of waiting, 2 years of training, 2 years of wounds carved into the seas by Teach's advance, and now it would all come to an end. Marco spread his wings and dashed forward alongside Ace as the rest of the crew landed. Jozu flexed his diamond form, harder and sharper than ever. Vista's twin blades gleamed. Thatch's brothers stood armed and steady, representing the family that Teach had betrayed. From the other side, Blackbeard's crew thundered into formation. Teach's laugh reverberated across the battlefield as he stepped forward, darkness spilling out around his frame, warping the air itself. At his side stood Shiryu with his blade drawn, coated in invisible armament haki. Van Augur adjusted his rifle calmly, every shot destined to pierce its mark. Lafitte floated eerily, whispering to his comrades, while Katarina Devon, San Juan Wolf, Avalo Pizarro, and the rest all spread across the cliffs. The battlefield ignited. Cannons roared from both sides, echoing across the jagged cliffs. Marco took to the skies, unleashing blazing phoenix fire against a barrage of bullets from Augur before going directly for Kazan. Jozu slammed into Burgess, diamond against brute muscle, their clash shaking the rocks apart. Vista's swords collided with Shiryu's invisible steel, sparks erupting in showers of light and shadow. The Whitebeard pirates carved their way through the waves of lesser criminals that Blackbeard had gathered, refusing to be drowned by numbers. Ace stepped into the heart of the battlefield, his eyes locked on Blackbeard. The air between them pulsed as if the sea itself feared their collision. Teach grinned, darkness flooding his fists. Ace unleashed a torrent of fire, a blazing inferno shaped like a dragon that surged across the battlefield, swallowing dozens of Blackbeard's men before it reached Blackbeard. But Teach countered by devouring the flames with his Yami Yami no Mi, dragging the blaze into the abyss of nothingness. Ace then shattered the ground with a quake fist that sent the terrain spiraling upward in jagged waves. Their battle began with brutal exchanges. Ace blurred forward, his body wreathed in white-hot fire, fists blazing like miniature suns. He swung, merging the quake with fire, and every strike was a fusion of crushing pressure and searing heat. The air shattered as one punch cracked against Teach's guard, sending him tumbling backward with flames clinging to his body, which he put out with his darkness. Teach retaliated by yanking Ace toward him with gravity, darkness binding like chains, but Ace detonated in a burst of fire, breaking free before his power could be nullified. He countered with a hockey-enhanced kick that split the cliffside in half. The battlefield bent under their might. Meanwhile, Marco clashed with Kuzan as Augur gave him support, his phoenix fire clashing against Kuzan's ice. Augur was a menace, each shot fast enough to pierce steel, but Marco's regeneration let him withstand the barrage and focus on Kuzan to keep him out of the fight. Jozu and San Juan Wolf's fight turned into a brutal contest of strength, fists hammering against unbreakable diamond and giant muscle. Wolf's fists were like massive boulders and came with mountain-crushing force, but Jozu met each one with his immense strength. With a roar, Jozu tackled Wolf into the skull-shaped base of Hachinosu, burying him under tons of shattered stone. Vista's duel with Shiryu cut through the chaos like a dance of death. Shiryu's invisibility gave him the advantage, but Vista's observation haki tracked his movements, their blades clashing in brilliant arcs of steel. Each strike released bursts of haki that split the battlefield around them. Everyone had grown stronger in the 2 years that Ace had spent training. All of them had trained with the singular purpose of taking down Blackbeard and avenging their father. But the heart of the war was still Ace versus Blackbeard. Teach unleashed a tidal wave of darkness, pulling debris and fire into an endless abyss. The world seemed to bend under his power, but Ace stood firm, his flames spiraling upward into a blazing storm. He created a massive sun of white-blue fire, heat so intense the rocks melted into molten rivers. With his other hand, he unleashed a quake punch, merging the two into one devastating technique. The flaming quake orb launched forward, colliding with Teach's darkness in an explosion that tore the sea apart. Water was pulled into the air, twisted into a spiraling maelstrom as flames turned it to steam. The shockwave flattened the fortress walls, and even the strongest fighters on both sides were forced to brace themselves. Blackbeard's devil fruit absorbed the power, but then he was met with a fist imbued with advanced conqueror's haki as Ace went through the explosion with blinding speed and punched Blackbeard in the chest, sending him flying back. Blackbeard staggered up with blood on his lips and roared with fury. He lunged forward, his darkness clawing into Ace's body, dragging him down and crushing his flames. For a moment, it looked as though Ace would be swallowed whole, but then his conqueror's haki burst forth again. Dozens of weaker pirates collapsed instantly, eyes rolling back as their will shattered under Ace's overwhelming presence. His blue flames roared higher, infused with his haki, turning pure white at the edges. He ripped free of Teach's darkness as his conqueror's haki pushed it back, and his body blazed like the embodiment of the sun itself. Every strike he unleashed now carried both the quake's devastation and the inferno's purity. He drove forward, fists colliding with Teach again and again, quakes cracking through bones while flames scorched flesh. Teach howled in pain, his darkness trying desperately to consume the light, but Ace refused to let it, his haki flowing out in massive waves. Finally, Ace gathered everything into one final attack. Flames spiraled around his arms, merging with the quake to create a burning sphere that vibrated with destructive power. He leapt high into the sky, the sun behind him, before bringing it crashing down upon Teach with godlike force. Marco ordered a sudden retreat, and everyone was ready to break away, just as planned. Then Ace's attack came down. The impact shattered the battlefield. The island itself cracked, molten rivers forming as fire and quake consumed everything in their path. Blackbeard screamed, engulfed in the destruction, his darkness unable to smother the sheer force of Ace's will. When the smoke cleared, Teach lay defeated, broken and silent, his empire crumbling around him. Seeing their leader defeated, the Blackbeard pirates went into a panic. Vista cut down Shiryu in the chaos, while Augur and Kazan pulled back. The Whitebeard pirates began to pressure the criminals who were fleeing. It was utter chaos. These pirates weren't united like Whitebeard's crew, and losing their strongest made them break. Soon enough, the Whitebeard pirates had won. Ace stood at the forefront, flames still burning across his shoulders, the weight of victory etched across his face. Across the seas, news spread like wildfire. Blackbeard was defeated. The Whitebeard pirates had risen again, and Ace, son of the pirate king and bearer of two of the strongest powers, had claimed his rightful place as Emperor of the Sea. At the same time, word from Wano carried across the seas. Monkey D. Luffy had defeated Kaido, toppling one of the strongest Yonko. Two brothers, both impossibly strong, both reshaping the world in their own image. Whispers turned to shouts. The seas trembled. The era of the brothers had begun. The world would never be the same. Make sure to subscribe and hit the like button for more One Piece videos.